Thanks for attending, everybody. First, I want to open it up to any general questions that you guys might have before we get into the topic of the home inspection contingency. Does anybody have any general questions? Not so far. Okay. Well, we'll get into it then. So we're going to go through the home inspection contingency in detail. And then now what's different from my trainings on this, our trainings on this from years past, is adding the addendum AC threshold language, because that is much more common now to use. So we'll go through that at the end of going through the inspection contingency itself. So as always, I just want to remind everybody to stop me at any time to ask questions. I hope that everybody is muted right now, but unmute yourself if you do have a question, and we'll get into it. So the home inspection contingency is divided into 3 sections. The first section defines inspections, and then there are other additional provisions laid out for buyers and sellers. The second section is the contingency language itself. And then the third section is the right to cure and how the contract plays out, how the inspection contingency plays out if a notice of defects is served. And we'll go over all of this in detail. I'm just having issues with my Zoom windows here. There we go. Taylor, can you mute for me? Thanks. Sorry, bear with me, everyone. Not sure what's going on with this window. Here we go. Okay. So first up, the first section, as I said, defines inspections versus testing. So I'm just going to read through this. So starting at 178, buyer may only conduct inspections or tests if specific contingencies are included as a part of this offer. So that's just a provision for the buyer. An inspection is defined as an observation of the property, which does not include an appraisal or testing of the property other than testing for leaking carbon monoxide, testing for leaking LP gas, or natural gas used as a fuel source, which are hereby authorized. Then it further defines and differentiates what a test is. So a test is defined as the taking of samples of materials such as soils, water, air, or building materials from the property for lab or other analysis of these materials. And then here's a provision for the seller. Seller agrees to allow the buyer's inspectors, testers, and appraisers reasonable access to the property upon advance notice, if necessary, to satisfy the contingencies in this offer. Buyer or licensees or both may be present at all inspections and testing, except as otherwise provided. Seller's authorization for inspections does not authorize buyer to conduct testing of the property. So breaking that all down, this is good. This section is good to point to when, in buyer consultations, for example, in explaining what an inspection is, I always refer to this section. You're going to have a general home inspection as a part of your offer. It's a part of the transaction. An inspection is defined in the contract as an observation of the property. So, which is different from having a test of materials. So, testing of perhaps asbestos or mold. That testing contingency is addressed in our addendum A's. And why they just, they want to make the differentiation here, because, and this happens all the time, as we're going through these inspection contingency processes, we get a lot of questions about people wanting to do testing. And it's just spelled out right here that this is only covering the inspection itself, which again is that observation of the property. Line 182, seller agrees to allow buyers, inspectors, testers, and appraisers reasonable access to the property. Again, this is just great to point right to a seller who may have objections to allowing an inspector into the property or an appraiser into the property. It's just spelled out again that we can point to this and say, by agreeing to this offer, by accepting this offer, Mr. Seller, you have allowed access to the buyers, inspectors. We have had pushback on that. So again, it's just nice that it's all just right here for everybody. Buyer or licensees or both may be present at all inspections and testing. It is not a requirement for us as agents to be at our home inspections. It is a office policy that we want our agents to be in attendance. If you cannot attend your home inspection, and the buyer is going to be there, please make sure that you are making arrangements to have somebody cover for you. It's just a protection for our clients. We want them to be able to have somebody there who can answer questions. And generally speaking, it is time for the general home inspector and the buyer to go through the home together. But we just need to be there as professional support. Moving on. Wish that. And then it just again says one more time, except as otherwise provided, seller's authorization for inspections does not authorize the buyer to conduct testing of the property. So they just really want to hit it home that unless there's a testing contingency in this offer and the seller agrees to a testing contingency, that the seller will authorize it if it's included. But if we're just speaking strictly to the inspection contingency in this section. Note 186, any contingency authorizing testing should specify the areas of the property to be tested, the purpose of the test, any limitations on buyers testing, and any other material terms of the contingency. Again, that's all spelled out in the addendum A, which will have further trainings on that. Line 189, buyer agrees to promptly restore the property to its original condition after buyer's inspections and testing are completed unless otherwise agreed to with the seller. Buyer agrees to promptly provide copies of all inspection and testing reports to the seller. I have this highlighted. We get this question a lot. We get the question that, well, the buyer paid for the home inspection. Do we need to provide it to the seller? We need to provide it to the seller to help complete negotiations. But beyond that, the seller just is automatically reserved the right to any reports that are done on their home, whether or not the buyer has paid for them. So again, spelled out right in here that a buyer needs to deliver those copies of the inspection reports and testing reports to the seller. Promptly is the word that they use for the timeline. It's my practice that we generally get our home inspection reports within 24 hours after the home inspection. And I forward it right on to the listing agent, and then I'll follow up with a phone call later on. I'll let them know, main concerns from the buyer as we know them from having the inspection, but that the buyer still needs to go through the report, and we'll be talking and reaching back out to the listing agent with further conversation. Seller acknowledges that certain inspections or tests may detect environmental pollution, which may be required to be reported to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So just a disclaimer there. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, moving on. So the second section is the inspection contingency itself, which is kind of a three-pronged contingency. So starting at line 193, if you are going to include the inspection contingency in your offers, you're going to put a check mark box on 193, an X. And again, It states right again, this contingency only authorizes inspections, not testing. So point 1, this offer is contingent upon a Wisconsin registered or Wisconsin licensed home inspector performing a home inspection of the property after the date on line 1 of this offer that discloses no defects. The main takeaway of this line is that it has to be a Wisconsin registered or Wisconsin licensed home inspector. We can't have Uncle Joe, who is really handy, come in and do the inspection for the buyer. It has to be a registered or licensed home inspector in the state of Wisconsin. Point 2, this offer is further contingent upon a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party performing an inspection of. And then in these lines, you would list additional property components or areas that you know that the buyer would like to have inspected right away. I'm going to move on to the third prong, and then I'm going to circle back to that. So point 3 is buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection, provided they occur prior to the deadline specified at line 206. Inspections shall be performed by a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party. So in practice, you're going to have your general home inspection, and the buyer, based off of what the general home inspection finds, may have follow-up inspections recommended in that general home inspection report. Bullet point 2, where you might want to list any additional property components or areas that you know that the buyer would like to have inspected right away. You're going to use these lines when you're writing the offer. If you know, for example, let's say you're showing a home and you can see that the roof is compromised and buyer wants to have a roofer come out and look at that right away. You would list roof in these lines to allow the buyer to have that roof inspection happen right away. If you don't have anything in those lines, then you have to rely on the home inspection, the home inspector, to make the recommendation to have that follow-up roof inspection. So, you know, a general home inspector is probably going to call out that roof and say, you know, I recommend having a roofer come out and look at this and see if it needs to be replaced, see if it just needs to be repaired. But unless you have that recommendation from the general home inspector, you cannot have that follow-up inspection, that roof inspection. So, and again, if you want to have that buyer have the ability to have that roof inspection right away, you know, in conjunction with the general home inspection, then you would write that in line 197 to 198. Any questions about that? Okay. Line 203 is a provision for the buyer. Buyer shall order the inspections and be responsible for all costs of inspections. This is a line that I've had to point to a buyer often. And again, also something that I bring up in my buyer consultations. Just, you know, serving as an expectation for what the buyer is going to have to pay for as a part of this process. You know, they're going to be paying for the general home inspection, which I always say is around $350 to $500. But then they also might want to budget for any follow-up inspections that might come as a result from that general home inspection. So, you know, generally speaking, contractors will come out and give free estimates. Where it might be costly for a buyer is for those more involved inspection. So chimney is the first thing that comes to mind. With a chimney inspection, for example, it involves cleaning the chimney and then scoping it with a camera. And that's usually another $250 for a buyer. But the buyer having an understanding that that $250 inspection could reveal tens of thousands of dollars of work. So, you know, it's a protection for them, and that's definitely in their interest to pay for those. That said, too, I want to point out that it can be negotiated for both buyer and seller to pay for follow-up inspections. But generally speaking, it's the onus is on the buyer to pay for those things so that they can find out what's going on with the home, going in eyes wide open. And then, if it's revealed that there's tens of thousands of dollars worth of chimney repairs, for example, they're going to use that estimate and go back to the seller to try and negotiate. You'll also see when we get to the addendum AC why it's important to have these estimates coming from reputable third parties as well. So 204 to 205 is a big caution line for the buyer. Buyers should provide sufficient time for the home inspection and or any specialized inspections, as well as any follow-up inspections. So that's a warning as we go into the next line, which gives us the deadline for the home inspection contingency. So line 206, this contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless the buyer within, and I think a good guideline is 10 to 14 days after acceptance, delivers to seller a copy of the written inspection report dated after line 1, and a written notice listing the defects identified in those reports to which the buyer objects. The takeaway here is that you're naming the inspection contingency deadline on line 206. Again, 10 to 14 days is what's typical. If you're writing competitively, I would just keep in mind that the shorter the inspection contingency deadline, the better for the seller. But again, we want to give ourselves enough time to have that general home inspection. Sometimes, depending on the market, inspectors are booked out a couple days. And then we want to have time for follow-up inspections as a result of that general home inspection. And that, again, can take a couple days for an electrician or a roofer to get over to the house. And then once we gather up all of that information, based off of what the follow-up inspections reveal, then we need to leave ourselves time for negotiating the inspection. So all of that has to be done within this time frame. If we're getting down to the wire on these things, an amendment can always be proposed to extend home inspection deadlines, any deadline in the offer, I'll say. But again, you can change deadlines if all parties agree, and you would do that with an amendment to the offer. Moving on, line 209, caution, a proposed amendment is not a notice of defects and will not satisfy the notice requirement. We'll be getting into the notice requirement soon. For the purposes, lines 210 through 211, for the purposes of this contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge or written notice before signing this offer. So this is just setting us up for the next section, which is the section on right to cure. I'll go on and define a defect as well. So defect, as defined on lines 445 through 447, means a condition that would have a significant adverse effect on the value of the property, that would significantly impair the health or safety of future occupants of the property, or that if not repaired, removed, or replaced, would significantly shorten or adversely affect the expected normal life of the premises. So again, these lines 210 to 215, or sorry, 209 to 215 are setting us up for the next section. So when a buyer is writing an offer on a property, they receive the real estate condition report. And on that real estate condition report should be defects that the seller is aware of. If it comes down to a notice of defects being served on this property in this transaction, the buyer can technically not name anything that they had knowledge of from that real estate condition report. That being said, if there's something named in a condition report, and let's say it was a roof leak, and the buyers had an understanding that there was a roof leak. If they have the home inspection contingency and a follow-up home inspection, roof inspection, and it's revealed that the entire roof needs to be replaced, that changes that. The buyer did not have the knowledge of the true nature and extent of that roof leak issue. So that could be something that a buyer could name on a notice of defects because it was beyond what they were originally told in that real estate condition report. So again, I am speaking strictly to lines 210 and 211 when I'm referring to that. And just need to also comment here that, you know, seasoned agents, new agents, I mean, we're always the inspection contingency is by far the most confusing of the contingencies in the offer to purchase. And as you start to practice and see how these things play out, you'll have a better understanding of them, of it. But I just want to invite you guys, these are these situational questions that Joni and I love to talk through with you guys. So, you know, if you have a question, just again, talking through, you know, this is the scenario, you know, what's best practice, please make sure that you are asking those questions of us as well. You know, it's not just strictly contract stuff, but these situational questions as well. And again, you know, seasoned agents are asking us that all of the time. We love talking through those things. So, okay, so this is section 2, lines 193 to 215. This is like the inspection contingency language itself. Now we kind of get and move to the consequences and how the transaction plays out as you're moving through negotiations on the inspection contingency. So, and I'm going to go through this, and then after this, we will kind of put it into practical purposes, and I'll explain how all this plays out. So when you're writing an offer with a buyer, now the next section is you have to determine whether or not you are going to give the seller the right to cure as it relates to the inspection contingency. The right to cure may or may not play out. Ideally, it's never going to get kicked in, but we have to be prepared in the event that it does. So that's why we give the buyer an option here on line 216. The seller shall or shall not have the right to cure the defects. If the seller, well, I'll just keep continuing through this. So this again, the right to cure only kicks in if the notice of defects is delivered. So line 217, if the seller has the right to cure, and this spells it out for the buyer, the seller has the right to cure. The seller may satisfy this contingency by delivering a written notice to the buyer. It's 10 days if it's left blank, but I've written in, you know, a range of 3 to 10 days after the buyer's delivery of the notice of defects stating the seller's election to cure. The seller also may satisfy the contingency by curing the defects in a good and workmanlike manner and delivering to the buyer a written report detailing the work done no later than 3 days prior to closing. The offer shall be null and void if the buyer makes timely delivery of the notice of defects and written inspection report and seller does not have the right to cure, or the seller has the right to cure, but the seller has chosen not to cure the defects, so the deal is dead, or the seller does not timely deliver the written notice of election to cure. So let's break this all down. The concept of the right to cure is really confusing. It's also attached to our appraisal contingencies. So we went through that last week. The reason why it's so confusing is because it might not ever come into play. It's again only triggered when a notice of defects is served. So in practice, when we are having our inspection contingencies and inspection negotiations, our hope is that we are working through any of the buyer's concerns and what the seller is willing to do via negotiations and doing that all on amendments. So buyer and seller are coming to a meeting of the minds on what their concerns are and how the seller is willing to repair them. Where right to cure comes into play is if there's a breakdown in those negotiations and neither party can come to an agreement, then this is kind of that final line in the sand, and really just spells out who has the power to declare the offer null and void. So if the seller has the right to cure, then the power to kill the deal, to declare the offer null and void, is in their court. So if there is a breakdown in negotiations and buyer, came to the seller and said, we want the roof, foundation, and electrical fixed before we are comfortable moving forward. And they go to the seller first and say, these are the repairs that need to be done. This is the manner in which we want them to be repaired. And we want this all to be done prior to closing. And seller says, I'm not willing to do any of that. Then now the ball goes back into the buyer's court to determine, okay, the seller has said they're not going to do any of that stuff. Do we want to move forward in the offer and just take the house as is? Or do we want to now draw that line in the sand to the seller and say to them, okay, you did not agree to our request. Now we're forcing the decision on you. And you're going to now do that with the notice of defects. And you're going to say, now you're going to use an actual notice. It's a different form. You're going to spell out those defects, which are, again, the roof, foundation, and electrical in this example. And you're going to say to them, now I'm going to give you the choice. I want you now to fix all three of these things, or let me out of the deal. And now the ball is in the seller's court to take that notice of defects, and they can either say, oh, shoot, we said no before, but now, we don't have any other buyer waiting in the wings. We have an offer on another house. I actually think it's in our best interest to cure these defects and keep you in the deal. So now the seller has to fix all three of those things. Before, they had an opportunity to negotiate with the seller or with the buyer and maybe whittle that list down. But now that all three of them are on this notice of defects, the seller has to cure all three. Or the seller has the choice to say, I'm still standing firm. I don't want to fix any of those items. I am willing to let you out of the deal, Mr. Buyer, and move forward and put it back out on the market. If the buyer does not give the seller the right to cure in the offer to purchase, just by that mere delivery of the notice of defects, the buyer has killed the deal and declared the offer null and void. The buyer has that power to declare the offer null and void because they did not give the right to cure to the seller. So you can see it's more advantageous for the seller to have the right to cure in the offer to purchase. I would say 9.9 times out of 10 in this competitive market, and it's been this way for the last few years, buyers are giving the seller the right to cure. When I first started in real estate, it was a buyer's market. I didn't even know how to explain the right to cure, really, because we just weren't giving the right to cure. We were just automatically giving that buyer, or we were advising the buyers, just don't give the seller the right to cure. If there's something big enough that you want to serve a notice of defects on and just walk away from the deal, you'll have that ability. So again, in this climate, it's just, commonplace for the buyer to be giving the seller the right to cure in the offer to purchase. Again, I just want to really hit home and stress to everybody that our goal always is to negotiate through the home inspection via coming to a meeting of the minds versus getting down to this final line in the sand. It puts our buyers in, puts everybody in a position that they might not want to be in, right? So our goal again is always to just amend the offer, come to an agreement on how repairs are to be done, versus getting to this point. This next slide is a home inspection flow chart that is available on the WRA. I can also email this out. I can take a attendance on who was here and email this out to you guys. I had this taped up on my desk when I first started. It's a great visual on how the home inspection contingency gets mapped out based off of whether or not the seller has the right to cure. So in red, if the seller does not have the right to cure, it shows how you can amend. It just, again, maps out getting to the closing table. In blue, it maps out if the seller does have the right to cure. So I would definitely, I have this in a PDF form that I can email out to you guys. But again, I had this like taped to my desk when I first started real estate because the home inspection contingency was really hard for me to get a handle on. So it can get confusing. So any questions so far? Good. Okay. You guys are all whizzes at this, I bet. So again, in practice, I kind of went through all of this already. Clarifying language around the right to cure in a good and workmanlike manner. So I'm going to show you guys this language that you can add in to our offers, and then we'll get to market of the moment language, which is that addendum AC and that threshold language. Let's see what time it is here. Let's see how we're doing on time. 12:30. Okay, we're doing really good on time. So in our clause libraries, we have a clause which can be added to our offers, which gives the buyer additional protections when it comes to the right to cure. So let's say the buyer gives the seller the right to cure and a notice of defects is delivered and seller decides we will cure the defects. The default language in the offer to purchase is that the seller can cure the defects, me making repairs on those defects in a good and workmanlike manner, and it stops there. So as you can imagine, good and workmanlike manner is pretty gray. And so adding this language helps the or puts more strict parameters on how repairs can and need to be done. So if you add this in your offer, what the clause reads is seller shall have the right to cure in a good and workmanlike manner. And again, it would stop in the offer to purchase, but it continues on saying using professional licensed experts with the benefit of permit as required and in accordance with municipal building code and generally accepted construction and safety standards. The scope of work shall be defined by an independent third-party expert. So either a roofing consultant, structural engineer. So again, it just puts extra protection on the buyer in case the seller does elect to cure. We then have the peace of mind knowing that if the seller does elect to cure and they fix that roof, that it has to be done by a professional, a qualified professional. Again, Uncle Joe can't come in and make that repair. It's got to be done with a licensed professional. So that's again in our clause library. And if you have questions on how to find that, let me know. Or our tech people.
So that can only be used on the initial offer. You can't put that in later on.
You can't. I mean, well, you can, but the buyer and seller have to agree to it. So that's why you want to put that in there right off the bat when you're writing the offer to purchase. Because let's say if it does come down to you serving a notice, you can't that time say, oh, now we want to make sure that if you do elect to cure, you have to do it this way. As we went through, I don't even remember now, within the past few weeks, we did an amendment versus a notice, differentiating the two. If you are negotiating through the inspection contingencies and you're doing an amendment, the buyer has more power to spell out how they want to have those repairs being done. So, again, we'll just keep using this roof. So seller at seller's expense to have the roof repaired according to the estimate from XYZ roofing company prior to closing. And they can negotiate that repair in an amendment and spell out how they want it to be done. Now, if the seller doesn't agree to that and a buyer now is being forced to send a notice of defects, in that notice of defects, they can't spell out how the work needs to be done. All they can say is, we have a roof defect, and then leave it at that. And then the offer dictates to the seller how they're going to cure it if they elect to cure it. So that's why we're adding in this language. And it seems, again, it's because it's attached to the right to cure, it might not ever come into play, but it just gives the roadmap to the seller if they do elect to cure, and it gives that extra protection for the buyer.
Got it.
So, okay. Okay, so now the inspection threshold language. I'm coupling this with the training on the inspection contingency now that this form is in our market and will probably be used for the foreseeable future. Before this language, there was similar language floating around out there. Different brokerages were using different versions of this language. The WRA and the GMAR wanted to make this all in one cohesive contingency threshold language so that everybody was operating under the same terms. So again, this came into play during our, just again, the competitive landscape. So to make our offers stand out, we wanted to communicate to sellers, we want an inspection contingency, but we just want it mostly for informational purposes. We're not going to come to you and ask you for anything under a certain dollar amount. Why we like this is because it allows the ability, and it makes a seller feel more comfortable about accepting a inspection contingency if they see this threshold in there. Otherwise, the alternative is for buyers to write offers without inspection contingencies, which is just extremely dangerous and that's a little dramatic. It's just not ideal. Having an inspection just protects all parties. So already we're seeing the aftermath of buyers writing offers without inspection contingencies, discovering things after they close, and attempting to come back to sellers. And we're just seeing a lot of potential lawsuits because of it. So again, anyway, we love having this inspection threshold because it allows the opportunity for the buyer to have it, gives extra protection for the seller. I see a question in the chat, I think. Yes, Liz, it's just the WB 41. So thank you for that question. So again, this is on the GMAR Addendum AC, additional contingencies. This is not built into the offer, so you're going to grab this form from Zip Forms and use it along with and attach it to the offer. I'm just going to go right into it. So starting at line 8, you're going to hit an X if you are going to use this language. Just to let you know, there are 2 other provisions in the Addendum AC that address the appraisal gap and the accelerator clause. So you can use this form and use one or all of the additional provisions. So that's why we still need to mark an X. So a buyer agrees not to submit any notice of defects or amendment for repairs, replacement, credit, or price reduction under the inspection contingency in this offer, unless the cumulative estimated cost to repair or replace the defects identified in the inspections exceed a certain dollar amount. So a buyer might say 5,000 here, they might say 10,000 here, but they're saying right up front, I'm not going to attempt to negotiate with you, Mr. Seller. I'm not going to send a notice of defects if those repairs fall under this $5,000 threshold. If the seller has the right to cure the defects, if the seller has the seller has the right to cure the defects. So excuse me. So you'd only use this inspection threshold language if the buyer is giving the right to cure in the offer to purchase, which again, 9.9 times out of 10, they will be. Moving on, line 11, if the buyer delivers a notice of defects, seller's election to cure applies only to the balance of the items for which the cumulative cost to repair or replace exceeds the amount stated on line 10. This is a question and a point of confusion we have learned. So if the seller has received a notice of defects, the threshold amount that the buyer put in this provision is 5,000, and the cost to repair the defects is 10,000. The seller is only obligated to cure $5,000 of those $10,000 in repairs. We can see already how this is playing out and how it can be a point of confusion, even in with just determining how that buyer is going to be giving that credit or reimbursing the seller for those that $5,000 threshold. If we're getting down to that point, please see Joni or I. Those are going to have to be individual conversations. This language, again, it's just providing a good roadmap, but there's a lot of what ifs and how to's still built in with all of these. A lot of questions still. Line 13 through 15. So estimates of costs for repair or replacement shall be obtained from an independent qualified professional selected by the buyer. And it's built right in here. Seller agrees to provide access for the buyer and buyer's qualified professionals to obtain such estimates. Again, we love that. It's saying right to the seller that you have to agree to let the contractors in. The buyer, again, another provision for the buyer shall pay any costs associated with obtaining these estimates. The parties may together agree on the cost to repair or replace the defects for purposes of this provision. Estimates obtained or agreed upon are utilized only for execution of this provision and do not affect any seller right to cure unless specifically agreed in writing. Then moving on, you can put in extra provisions that may again not play out, but kind of spell it out up front. So line 20, seller may also obtain estimates by an independent qualified professional and deliver to the buyer by the deadline for the inspection contingency, if delivered before any notice of defects is delivered to the seller by the buyer. So this is giving the seller the option to obtain their own estimates as well. So I would say as a buyer's agent, you might want to include that. Again, it's an extra nicety for the seller to have that ability to obtain their own estimates and not solely relying on the buyer's estimates. If the seller timely delivers such estimates and the estimates differ from the buyer's estimates for the same items, the parties agree they will average the different estimates for each affected item to arrive at the costs for purposes of this provision. So if the seller does take it upon themselves to obtain their own, they deliver it to the buyer prior to the deadline for the inspection contingency and prior to receiving a notice of defects. then now we've got two estimates, and it's saying right in here, we're going to average the two. So it's giving a lot of power to the seller, but again, it might just be a good idea if you're writing in a competitive, if you're writing competitively, to include that. Line 25 through 27, either party may extend the original deadline for the inspection contingency by, and you can put in a date or a number of days here, it's 5 if left blank. So they may extend the original deadline for the inspection contingency by 5 days to allow for follow-up inspections and or obtaining estimates. Either party may do this by delivering written notice of extension if delivered to the other party prior to the expiration of the original deadline. So this is nice, because let's say you're getting down to the inspection contingency deadline, you're still waiting for the electrician and the roofer to send back their estimates. If you include this provision, then buyer could send a notice to the seller and say, we're just extending this by 5 days, and vice versa. The seller could say to the buyer, we want more time, we're just going to extend by 5 days. They don't have to have a reason to, you don't have to have an amendment to agree to it because you're agreeing to it already right here. And it's just with a written notice saying we are going to elect to extend this by 5 days. So, so again, this is new to our marketplace. We're seeing confusion, of course, it's a new form. And so, as we started introducing this form, we've tried to let people just have patience with it, call Joni or I with questions on it. And then, as we're moving through the contingency, we've received a ton of questions on it already. So, and we're learning as you guys learn as well. But again, we love having this be consistent language across the market. Everybody's using the same form. Everyone can have the same, should hopefully expect, or have the same expectations as it relates to how this all plays out. Of course, there's going to be difference of opinions, but we just are really glad that this was created for us. And these are just repeats of what I have said already. Further education and resources. So go to the WRA.org. I'm always, periodically, it's a little, anyway, I'm trying to promote, we are trying to promote, Joni, Kimmy, and I, go to the WRA and, look in their legal hot tips. If you just search for inspection, it'll come up with all sorts of resources for you. So if you just do inspection resources, that will bring you right to articles, legal hot tips, etc. The inspection contingency flow chart, you will also find this on the WRA. And then our YouTube channel, recently, or actually, I'm sorry, not recently, this was almost 2 years ago, we had a contract training on real life tales around the inspection contingency, which was really helpful just to kind of hear scenarios, right? When we can speak about these things practically, that's when it really clicks. So again, that's found on our YouTube channel, which you will find that on our KW resources page. I'm going to stop share and open this up for questions.